Hey everybody, it's Seim, and today I'm going to show you a really simple way to rewire the way you're thinking about how you're taking and making photos. Now, in recent months, I've been studying pictorialism a lot as I make new tools and try to take some of the past and bring those techniques into the digital age because there's so much we haven't discovered yet. I know I'm not the only one that's noticed that almost everything is being faked now. You go online, the images that are going viral of eclipses, of northern lights, most of the ones that you're seeing getting attention are faked in one way or another, oftentimes completely using AI. Fraud pages that are just gathering likes and following so they can do scams and things like that. And these images aren't real at all. So isn't it weird that we live in this world where we have more tools and technologies to create images than ever, but things are becoming more lifeless and sterile and lacking in emotion? Now, this should concern all of us as artists and photographers, but it should also concern us on a base level of journalism, of news, of like the separation between art and fact and imagination and reality. Now, if you go back 100 years before digital, there's film, there's dark rooms, there's chemicals. The pictorialists are on the scene. And what they're doing is they're saying, no, the camera is not simply a mechanical tool that's sterile. We're going to use blurs and we're going to use textures and we're going to use motion and we're going to use that to convey emotion in what we feel in our images. And so it was the artistic side versus the very technical static portrait that's like absolutely correct, nobody move, put them in a head brace, that sort of thing. Think about someone like Leonard Masson and how he was doing these pictorials where you had texture, you had almost this lo-fi, low detail. It's actually very hard to produce this kind of detail but sharpness, right? In digital, or is it? Maybe we're just looking at it the wrong way in terms of the way we edit. We're always thinking in absolutes when we edit, and the pictorialists, they weren't thinking in absolutes. They were saying, hey, we inherited the profession from the painters. We're going to make art. We're going to mix things in whatever way we want. They were still real photos, but the way that they were printing, they might have used things on the lens, right? You come to more modern portrait pictorialists like David Hamilton, and he would have things on the lens to kind of create blurs, to create glows, to create softness. But today I'm going to show you how to discover these kind of edits and how to rewire the way you think and stop being so absolutist in the way you photograph and in the way you edit. It's okay to have a little blur here and there if it's drawing focus. It's okay to have dark shadow like I talk about in Shadow Hackers all the time. It's okay to have texture and mistiness and glowiness. Okay, let me demonstrate what I mean. Here's a photo. All that's been done is a basic raw edit, right? Taken on the lake. It's very shadow rich. It's nice. I probably edited this with Provia in Filmish 2, and it's a good image. But can we do more with this? When you were standing in a place and you were taking a photograph, what did you feel? I think the essence of pictorialism, whether you're taking a more modern approach or an old school approach, is that a photo should have feeling. It should convey not just the shadow and the tone, but you should be able to convey the feeling, the emotion that you had in making that image. And you're making emotion part of your visualization. Think about that. Visualization isn't just your tone, your light, your shadow, it's your emotions. If you approach it from that, then how do you create and edit photos? I was actually working on updates for my new pictorialist actions today, but I want to show you just how to do it. I want to show you how I actually discover and experiment. And then when I find something that works, I make it into something that's a workflow tool. You can do the same thing. Let's just take this layer. Let's copy the background. Now, I'm assuming you have a basic Photoshop knowledge. If not, check out my Photoshop Fast course, but I'm going to kind of describe what I'm doing here as we go along quickly. On a surface level, right? If I go to Gauss and Blur, filter Gauss and Blur, and I put a 41 pixel blur on, well, it's blurry. This doesn't look so great, right? But blurs aren't what you actually think they are. If you look at how Orton would take two slides when he developed the Orton effect, and one will be blurry and one will be sharp, and he would use different exposure levels, and he would create this effect. And this is something that you can do in digital that I did in the recent Pictorialist release, where you can mix, for example, the blending modes of a layer. So here's our blurred layer of our background copy. And you can scroll over these different blending modes and you see all these different ways. This is a lot of times the way to discover magic. It's not so different than when pictorialists, they would take a photo and then they would use maybe textures, maybe out of focusness when they were printing, movement even. I think people often have this misconception that the really early photographer, they just didn't have the technology, the photos weren't sharp. Yes, lenses and consistency in optics and sensors and digital, all this has taken us a long ways. But actually, if you go back to a 5x7 glass plate from the early 1900s, they were incredibly high resolution and incredibly sharp. The pictorialists were intentionally creating these movements, these blurs, these shadows, these motions to create emotion and drama. Now, how do I discover how to do something when I'm doing something like this? I'll just start moving layers and experimenting. And then when I find something, I will save it and start creating actions that work with other actions. Let me show you what I mean. So I'm not using pictorialists. We're doing everything manually right now. I have my blurred background copy. Now I have to discover how to experiment with this blur. Let's make another layer. Now I'm going to apply a texture, let's say, to this layer. I could drag a texture in. I could use a photo of stone. I could use my naked darkroom textures. In this case, I'm going to do one I already have loaded in here and just put a water-stained paper texture on top of it. Now this doesn't look like much, but as always with textures, you go in and you change blending modes and things like that, and you get some interesting effects. Now remember, we still have this blurred layer, right? And we're getting the color of the texture. We're getting all the stuff going on with it. In this case, I'm not actually trying to use the texture itself, although that can be a really powerful tool for dramatic editing as well. So I'm going to rasterize this layer and just have the texture layer. Then I'm going to go up and go to Image and Adjustments, and I'm just going to desaturate that layer. So I'm not actually doing a color tint from that. When I'm doing advanced edits and trying to discover something, I'm trying to pull out the hidden emotion in a photo to get what I felt, I'm going to go to the texture layer here. Here's my texture. And I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, and Levels. All right, now I'm going to bring up the blacks and I'm going to bring down the lights. And so I'm making this texture like really intense, right? If I went back to normal blending mode, you see we now have this black and white texture that's really intense. I'm not actually going to use this texture. I'm going to go to Select Color Range. I went through all that work for the texture. Why? To do a color range selection that was randomized. Because when this texture is applied, it's a real organic thing, right? It's a texture of a real actual paper. And then we're mixing that in the way it was applied and the direction it was applied to our given image. So what I'm actually doing is I'm allowing myself to get this selection. So I click around on that texture until I find the right selection. Remember, white reveals, black conceals in a mask. I'm going to click OK. So I've made this selection, and you see it's just kind of this messy marching ants all over the place, but it's randomized. Okay, now I'm going to right click and feather. I'm just going to feather this by like 5 pixels, let's say, and just to kind of soften that off. Okay, so now that we have that, I'm going to go down here, and I'm just going to hit the trash can and delete the actual texture layer. I don't need that. I was just using that to create this texture. I'm now going to that background copy we made. I'm going down and I'm going to create a mask based on the selection that I made. And look what happens. Suddenly we have detail in our image again. Why is that? Because we created a mask based on a texture that it had modifications done to it to create this. Now here's the thing, what inspired me to go and experiment today and make this particular mix was actually going and looking at Leonard Misson's work, because I was looking at his photos and thinking like, okay, again, he's doing this kind of illustrative blur. These are photographs, but they're pushing things and moving things around. So you have a photograph, but it has this kind of ethereal, painterly-like feel to it, even though you still know it's a photograph. It's very different than something like somebody making an AI photo and then posting it and saying, look at this photo I took of the eclipse, and it makes no sense because the eclipse is on the horizon in the ocean. But a lot of people don't actually connect that. These aren't trying to fake. These are saying I took a photo and I made something artistic and beautiful from that. Now you can come back to this layer I made, and you can see how it's kind of adding this softness. It's affecting the way the weeds and the grass. And you would get a slightly different look each time you made this selection Each time you used a different texture, because what was I doing? I was taking these roundabout approaches. I was saying, I'm going to try and think like a pictorialist. What might Seim have thought when he was in the darkroom? Like, how can I get something cool? We need to rewire our brains because we're thinking sterile in terms of how we edit. And studying and creating pictorialism helps us step outside that. It doesn't mean we never want to go take a super high-res, beautiful, pristine landscape and print it at 60 inches as a wall portrait. It doesn't mean that all our photos have to be this way. But what this does is it opens up the flexibility of how we merge our right brain, left brain, and how we create photos. Now, this weird kind of blurry effect that I made here on its own might seem pretty insignificant, okay? But what did I actually do with this? Once I kind of had the vision, I said, okay, now I'm going to integrate this into Pictorialist, where we're kind of automating the building of layers. We're making grain, we're making all this stuff. So I run Pictorialist. I'm going to run Stieglitz. So I'm going to get that black and white kind of Stieglitzy look. All right, this looks good. Now I'm going to go down. That effect I just showed you, I automated it. I saved it all into an action that would integrate with all the layers of Pictorialist, and I made a mod that's called Microblender. Now I put Microblender on this, and you can see that it runs, and it gives me that layer that I just showed you how to make, right? Which I'm calling Microblender. And you can see now here, it just makes this subtle change in the way that the highlights and the way the surface. I could change this by how much I feathered the layer. I could change this by opacity. I could experiment with blending modes on this to get different textures and looks, and you can see how it affects radically when I change this. Because of this blurred layer combined with the texture and the masking that I created, what we have is not really a blur. What we have is a technique that can allow us to visualize and mix differently in the way we're using our shadow and our drama and our emotion. Now, the key here, you don't have to be using my actions, but you will benefit radically from saving anything that you come up with into an action. That's why I spend months and months and months experimenting on Pictorialist before I ever release the product, because I'm like, what of all these possible combinations works, and then how can that interact with other things? So for example, we put the Microblender layer, blur layer, that's not actually a blur, that I just showed you, right? And we ran it with Stieglitz and the black and white conversion. But what if I do Stieglitz tarnish, right? This remixes the layers in a different way, and look what happens. That micro blur layer is still there, but it's mixing now with other layers and textures. So you notice how it has a much more radical effect on the image in the Stieglitz tarnish mode than it did in the original Stieglitz mode. Now, what's happening here to create this ultimate look, which I could turn up and down. I could change the dynamic range. I could change curves. There's all kinds of things I could do. I could turn down the intensity of these layers. I could adjust the opacity of the Microblender layer. Ultimately, what we created is this nice image, but I wanted to do something more with it. And so we created this black and white that we can print as a fine art, and that's something a little more distinctive and emotional. Now, you might not like the way that I mix this particular image, but that's not really the point. The point is, as you start building up these layers, each one interacts with the other. That's why I can go into Pictorialist and I can do hours worth of editing literally in seconds, because it's moving and mixing and stacking layers in different ways, and I can quickly see what's happening. But you can do all these same things by going in and doing blurs and doing masks and doing textures. And what I really wanted to convey today is whether or not you use my tools or make your own, or you do everything from scratch and you want to spend hours doing it, it's actually really important to be flexible in the way we wire our editing and the way we're thinking. Because an edit, a blur, a texture, it's not always what it seems. And if you start using it in creative ways, you're going to discover things that are pretty amazing and that are going to give you results on your images that aren't AI generated, that aren't fakery. They're just you being creative and using your brain and mixing and adjusting to create beautiful fine art pictorialism. And the concept works on color, it works on portraits, it works on landscapes, it works on the streets. I could show you more examples of this, but I don't want this video to go long. And I think that I've covered the concept, and I hope you'll go out and put it to work. Let me know what you think in the comments. I want you guys, what do you think about pictorialists? How can that affect how we work as digital photographers today, or film photographers that are turning around and scanning and editing? It's pretty amazing. And it can give us an edge in this sterile AI world. All right, you guys, peace. Hit that like, subscribe button, and we'll see you next time.